Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something I think you'll find pretty fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, all the sort of unseen ways that the world is designed for men.
Okay.
And we're going to be using invisible women, data bias, in a world designed for men as our guide.
Okay.
Now, before you think that this is like some man-bashing session,
Right.
let me assure you it's not.
Okay.
It's about uncovering these data gaps that actually affect everyone,
Yeah.
even if you're not a woman.
Yeah, I think the book really shines a light on how deeply ingrained this male default is in our culture.
Yeah.
And it's not always about, like, deliberate exclusion. It's more often about how things have always just been done a certain way,
Right.
with men as the assumed standard.
It's become invisible over time, right?
Yeah.
And the book gives some really eye-opening examples, like, did you know that car safety features are mainly tested using crash test dummies based on the average male body?
It's true. And because of this, women face a much higher risk of injury and accidents. These safety features like airbags and seatbelts aren't optimized for them.
Yeah.
It's a pretty chilling example of how seemingly neutral designs can have real-world consequences.
It really makes you stop and think what other designs out there might have this hidden bias.
Exactly. It's about being aware of these data gaps and starting to ask, like, why is this designed this way?
And it doesn't stop at cars. The book tackles medical research, too, and how, for decades, studies primarily used male subjects.
Yeah, there was this assumption that findings would apply equally to women,
Right.
which is simply not true, and this has had very real consequences, as the book illustrates.
Yeah, the book mentions how women are more likely to die after a heart attack.
Oh, wow.
Because their symptoms often differ from the classic male symptoms.
This is a prime example of what's called Yentl syndrome,
Okay.
where women's pain is often dismissed as emotional
Oh.
or psychosomatic,
Wow.
leading to misdiagnosis and inadequate treatment.
Yeah.
It really underscores how crucial it is to have sex-disaggregated data in medical research.
It's almost as if women's bodies are treated as an anomaly,
Mm-hmm.
a deviation from the male norm.
Precisely. And this bias isn't limited to physical health. The book also delves into the under-researching of female-specific conditions,
Oh, okay.
like premenstrual syndrome or PMS.
PMS. Yeah.
It's quite astonishing that there's more research on erectile dysfunction,
Wow.
which affects a smaller percentage of the population than on PMS,
Right.
which impacts the majority of women.
That's a striking example of how those research priorities can be skewed.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, why is that? Is it because of cultural taboos around menstruation? Or maybe because research funding often flows towards conditions that are perceived as more serious?
It's likely a combination of factors,
Yeah.
but it highlights how cultural assumptions and biases can impact which conditions are deemed worthy of research,
Yeah.
and ultimately, how healthcare is delivered.
This is all so thought-provoking. And as if the physical world wasn't enough,
Right.
the book even exposes how algorithms are picking up on these gender stereotypes.
Yes. Even our seemingly objective digital systems can be swayed by the biases in the data they're trained on.
Right.
Take, for example, some speech recognition technology that struggles to understand women's voices
Really?
because it's trained primarily on male voices.
So even when we're interacting with technology, we're bumping up against this male default.
Absolutely.
And what about those like pocket-sized devices we all rely on? I've always struggled to find women's clothing with pockets big enough for my phone.
That's a great point.
Oh.
The book calls this the pocket-sized problem,
Okay.
highlighting how even something as simple as clothing design can reflect and perpetuate gender inequalities.
Oh, wow.
Historically, women were denied pockets,
Really?
often having to rely on men to carry their belongings.
Wow.
This is carried over into modern fashion, impacting women's accessibility to technology in their daily lives.
And it's not just about convenience, it can also be a safety issue.
Right.
If a woman can't easily access her phone, she might be more vulnerable in an emergency.
Absolutely. This seemingly small design detail speaks volumes about how deeply embedded these assumptions are in our culture.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that these data gaps have tangible consequences.
It's starting to feel like these hidden biases are everywhere.
Right.
Like once you start seeing them, you can't unsee them.
That's the power of this book.
Yeah.
It helps us question assumptions and start to see the world with a more critical lens.
So as we move forward in our deep dive, let's keep this in mind.
Yeah, okay.
How does the male default manifest in different areas of life? What are the implications?
Yeah.
And most importantly, what can we do about it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've got a lot more ground to cover, from
Yeah.
healthcare and public spaces to the workplace and even politics.
We do.
But for now, let's pause and let all this sink in for a moment.
Let's take a moment to think about where you might be encountering this male default in your own life. Beyond the examples we've discussed, what stands out to you? And how does it make you feel? We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of invisible women. Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into invisible women and how the world is often designed with men as the default.
Yeah.
It's amazing how much we've already uncovered, and
Right.
we're just getting started.
I know, it's really eye-opening, isn't it? And
Yeah.
we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah.
We talked about cars and medical research.
Right.
But this bias extends far beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that really struck me in the book is how the very spaces we inhabit,
Okay.
our cities, our homes, our workplaces, are often designed with a male user in mind.
You're right. We touched on that with hospital design
Yeah.
and women's safety.
Exactly.
But the book goes so much deeper.
Mm-hmm.
I was particularly struck by the discussion of how office temperatures
Oh, yeah.
are often based on male metabolic rates.
That's right. Studies show that office temperatures are often set too cold for women,
Oh, really?
who, on average, have slower metabolic rates than men.
Oh.
It might seem like a small thing,
Yeah.
but it can really impact women's comfort and productivity.
It's interesting how these seemingly minor design choices can have such a big impact
Right.
on people's daily experiences.
Yeah.
And it's not just about comfort, is it?
No, not at all.
Okay.
There's research suggesting that being constantly cold can actually be detrimental to women's health,
Oh, wow.
leading to increased stress
Yeah.
and even a higher risk of certain conditions.
That's incredible. And it makes sense when you think about it. Like,
Yeah.
if the standard office worker is assumed to be male,
Right.
then the design of the workplace will reflect that,
Yeah.
even down to the thermostat setting.
Exactly. And this male bias in architecture and urban planning goes way back.
Oh, okay.
The book talks about how historically cities were often designed around the needs of male workers and commuters,
Right.
often neglecting the needs of women who were traditionally seen as homemakers.
So the legacy of those early design choices is still shaping our cities today.
Absolutely. And it's evident in so many ways.
Okay.
From the lack of safe and accessible public transportation
Mm-hmm.
to poorly lit streets
Right?
and even the design of public restrooms.
Oh, don't even get me started on public restrooms.
Yeah.
The lines are always so much longer for women,
Right.
and there never seem to be enough stalls.
Yeah.
Plus, you often have to navigate those cramped spaces with a stroller
Yeah.
or young children in tow.
It's a perfect example of how these design oversights can create real challenges for women,
Yeah.
especially those who are caregivers.
It makes you wonder what city planners were thinking, or rather not thinking,
Right.
when they design these spaces.
Yeah.
It's like they envision the city as being populated by single able-bodied men
Hmm.
who never have to worry about childcare or accessibility.
Well, maybe not quite that extreme.
Okay.
But the point is that by designing for a narrow slice of the population,
Right.
we end up creating a built environment that excludes and disadvantages a huge portion of people.
It's like this male default is so deeply embedded
Yeah.
that we don't even notice it most of the time.
And that's why it's so important to bring these issues to light.
Right?
Visible Women does a fantastic job of highlighting these design flaws
Yeah.
and encouraging us to think critically about the spaces we inhabit.
Speaking of design flaws, the book also delves into how this male bias shows up in the products we use every day.
Right.
Like smartphones, which, as we mentioned earlier, are often too large for women's hands and pockets.
It's not just phones either.
Okay.
Think about power tools,
Right.
kitchen appliances,
Okay.
even gardening equipment.
Right.
They're often designed for men's grip strength and body size,
Yeah.
making them difficult and sometimes even dangerous for women to use.
You know, that reminds me of something we discussed earlier about precarious work and occupational health.
Yeah.
Women working in male-dominated fields like construction or manufacturing are already facing increased risks.
Yeah.
And then you add in the fact that they're often using tools and equipment that weren't designed for their bodies.
Exactly.
It's no wonder they're more susceptible to injury.
It all comes back to that gender data gap.
Right.
When we don't collect and analyze data that takes gender into account,
Yeah.
we end up with products, systems, and environments that simply don't work well for everyone.
So how do we start to challenge this male default in the built environment? It seems like such a huge ingrained problem.
Well, the first step is awareness, like we're doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
The book stresses the need for data that considers gender.
Okay.
Things like travel patterns, safety, concerns the specific needs of women. in various contexts.
Hmm.
That's saying if you don't measure it, you can't manage it.
That's a good one. So you're saying we need to start measuring how these design choices are impacting women's lives?
Exactly. And
Yeah.
once we have that data, we can start advocating for more inclusive, gender-responsive design.
Okay.
And everything from urban planning to product development,
This is where that idea of data feminism comes in, right?
you got it.
Okay.
It's a movement that advocates for using data to challenge gender inequality
Hmm.
and create a more just and equitable world. Data feminism recognizes that data isn't neutral.
Right.
It's shaped by power structures and societal biases.
So it's not about rejecting data altogether,
Right.
but rather about being aware of those biases
Yeah.
and using data in a way that promotes equality.
Exactly.
It's like reclaiming data as a tool for social change, not just accepting it as some objective truth.
Exactly. And Invisible Women highlights some truly inspiring examples of how data feminism is already making a difference.
Oh, wow.
Take Data2X, for instance,
Okay.
an organization working to improve the availability and quality of gender data globally.
Okay.
There are also numerous researchers and activists who are
Right.
using data to expose gender bias in everything from healthcare to the tech industry.
It's exciting to see how data can be a powerful tool for empowering women
Yeah.
and challenging systems of oppression.
It's about telling the whole story, not just the half that's been traditionally prioritized.
And when we have access to better data,
Mm.
we can make better decisions.
Right.
We can design better products,
Uh-huh.
build better cities,
Yeah.
and ultimately create a world that's truly inclusive and equitable for everyone.
And a more equitable world benefits us all.
Mm-hmm.
As we move forward, we encourage you to think about the data gaps that exist in your own life. What information is missing, whose stories are not being told, and how can we use data to amplify those voices and make a difference?
That's something to really reflect on. Now let's shift gears a bit.
Okay.
Invisible Women doesn't stop at the physical world. It also tackles a huge and pervasive issue, the cultural landscape.
Yeah.
From movies and music to literature and the arts,
Right.
the male default is everywhere.
Absolutely. And this has a profound impact on how we see the world, ourselves, and each other.
Yeah.
It's about who gets to be the hero of the story and whose story gets told at all.
I think we've all experienced that feeling of not seeing ourselves reflected in the media we consume.
Mm-hmm.
And that lack of representation can be really powerful, even if we don't always realize it.
It sends a message about whose voices matter, whose experiences are valuable, and ultimately who gets to shape the narrative of our culture.
This is where it gets really interesting. How does this male default play out in the cultural world around us? And what are the consequences? We'll delve into that fascinating topic in the final part of our deep dive into Invisible Women. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into Invisible Women. We've uncovered so much about how the world is designed with men as the default, from cars and healthcare to cities and even those everyday products we use.
It's true.
Now let's get into something that's both fascinating and a bit unsettling, how this bias plays out in the cultural landscape.
When we talk about culture, we're talking about the stories we tell ourselves as a society. The stories we see in movies, here in music, read in books, and experienced through art, and as Invisible Women so powerfully points out, those stories have been overwhelmingly dominated by male perspectives for centuries.
It's like there's this default assumption that the universal human experience is actually a male experience.
Exactly. And it's not just about who's on screen or who's writing the books. It's about whose voices are deemed worthy of being amplified and whose stories are considered valuable enough to tell.
Yeah, the book shares some pretty shocking statistics about the underrepresentation of women in film and television, for instance, in films with male leads. Men get almost 3 times as much screen time as women.
Wow.
And even in films with male and female co-leads, men still speak twice as much as women.
It's a pretty stark imbalance, and it's no wonder that so many women feel like their stories aren't being reflected in mainstream media. Their experiences and perspectives are often marginalized or erased entirely.
And it's not just about quantity, it's about quality, too. Female characters are often relegated to stereotypical roles. The love interest, the damsel in distress, the supportive wife or mother, they rarely get to be the complex, flawed, and fully realized human beings that male characters so often are.
This limited representation sends a powerful message to both men and women about what's considered normal or important. It reinforces the idea that men are the protagonists of their own lives, while women are merely supporting characters.
It's like we're constantly being told that men's stories are the ones that matter, the ones that deserve to be told on a grand scale.
And this male default in storytelling extends to other areas of culture as well. The book discusses the underrepresentation of female composers in classical music, the historical exclusion of women from art institutions and academies, and the persistent gender pay gap in creative fields.
You know, it's fascinating how these cultural biases have persisted for so long, even as women have made significant progress in other areas of society. It's like there's this deep-seated resistance to recognizing and valuing women's creative contributions.
Invisible Women sheds light on the challenges women face when they try to break into these male-dominated fields. They often face discrimination, harassment, and a lack of support from those in positions of power who are invested in maintaining the status quo.
It's a classic example of that saying, if you can't see it, you can't be it. If young girls and women don't see themselves represented in the stories they consume, it makes it harder for them to imagine themselves as artists, writers, musicians, or filmmakers.
Exactly, and that's a real loss for everyone because we're missing out on so much talent, creativity, and unique perspectives. Imagine all the stories that haven't been told, all the perspectives that haven't been shared, simply because of this gender data gap in our culture.
It really makes you think about how different our world would be if we had a more balanced representation of genders in the stories we tell.
It's an exciting thought, and Invisible Women doesn't leave us in a place of despair. It actually offers a sense of hope that things are beginning to change. We're seeing more female directors, writers, and producers in Hollywood. We're hearing more music by female composers, and there's a growing movement to reclaim women's history and celebrate their artistic achievements.
It's like we're finally starting to see some cracks in that male default of culture, and through those cracks, a whole new world of storytelling and creative expression is emerging.
And that's a world that's richer, more diverse, and more representative of the full spectrum of human experience. A world where everyone has the opportunity to see themselves reflected in the stories that shape our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Invisible Women, we want to leave you with a challenge. Start paying attention to the gender representation and the cultural products you consume. Are women's stories being told? Are their voices being heard? And if not, what can you do to support and amplify those voices?
Because ultimately, creating a more equitable and just world starts with the stories we tell ourselves. By challenging that male default in our culture, we can create a world where everyone have the opportunity to not just see themselves reflected in the stories we tell, but to be the authors of their own narratives.
That's it for this deep dive. Thank you for joining us as we explored Invisible Women. We hope you've gained some new insights and that you'll continue to question the world around you. Remember, even small changes can make a big difference.